In this video, we're going to discuss new advanced VM hardware support in vSphere 7 Update 1. vSphere 7 Update 1 introduces support for new virtual hardware capabilities to secure and enhance virtual machine workloads. At the end of this video, we'll meet the following learner objectives. We'll describe enhanced vMotion compatibility, or EVC, for vSGA GPU VMs. We'll enable EVC for GPU VMs, describe AMD SEVES, and identify the requirements for AMD SEVES. Enhanced vMotion compatibility, or EVC, has been around for a number of years for CPUs. This feature masks CPU features to create a common baseline in a cluster. EVC for vSGA GPUs does the exact same thing, but for GPU feature sets. It is an extension of the existing EVC architecture and defines a common baseline of GPU feature sets in a cluster. EVC for vSGA is supported for hardware GPUs and also software GPU renderers in ESXi. Features masked by a baseline are not exposed to the virtual machines. Enabling enhanced vMotion compatibility for GPU VMs is done in the very same way as CPU EVC mode. We can enable EVC at an ESXi cluster level. All ESXi hosts in the cluster must satisfy the GPU requirements of the defined baseline. Additional hosts will not be able to join the cluster if they cannot satisfy the baseline requirements. A mixed cluster of ESXi 6.7 and ESXi 7 is supported when using enhanced vMotion compatibility at a cluster level. EVC for GPU can also be enabled at a virtual machine level. For this, VM compatibility for ESXi 7 Update 1 or Virtual Hardware version 18 is required. And as a result, VMs that are using EVC for GPU at a VM level can only run on ESXi 7 Update 1 hosts. So as we said, you can enable EVC for vSGA at a cluster in the same settings as you would for CPU EVC. You would select the baseline from the graphics mode dropdown. A description of the baseline will appear in the bottom of the wizard. You enable EVC for vSGA GPU VMs for virtual machine level in the same way that you would enable CPU EVC for those virtual machines. Again, select the preferred graphics mode baseline from the drop-down menu. Hardware version 18 is required to use EVC for vSGA GPU at a VM level. An ESXi host may fail to join a cluster if it cannot satisfy the EVC baseline. The ESXi host might lack the appropriate hardware, or the EVC baseline might require changes. A virtual machine may fail to power on if no host in the cluster can meet the VM requirements for EVC. The EVC baseline on the virtual machine might require changes, or a compatible host might be in maintenance mode. A VM may fail to migrate to a host if that host cannot satisfy the VM's EVC requirements. The target ESXi host might lack appropriate hardware, or the VM EVC baseline may need to be changed. A virtual machine's VMware.log will report the GPU capabilities of the VM during power on. The value of EVC host ID is unique for each renderer. In this example, the value of 0 in EVC host ID is a GL renderer, and the value of 1 is a software renderer. The ESXi hostd.log will also report the host capabilities during the hostd service startup. The host's capabilities are also cached in the following file. The hostd.log and the cache file are also updated if a GPU driver is installed or updated. Secure Encrypted Virtualization Encrypted State (SEVES) is a new hardware feature that is enabled in AMD CPUs. SEVES encrypts the VM guest memory and register state, protecting it from access from the hypervisor or other VMs running on the hypervisor. Components of AMD SEVES include the AMD Platform Security Processor, which is embedded within a supported AMD CPU. There are updates to the VM kernel driver, the virtual machine monitor, and the virtual machine runtime. And a supported guest operating system is required to take advantage of this feature. In order to enable AMD SEVES on a VM, you must meet the following requirements. Be using an AMD Zen 2 or later CPU, using a compatible BIOS, running ESXi 7 Update 1. The virtual machine must be running hardware version 18 and in EFI mode. The virtual machine must be configured to reserve all virtual machine memory and be running a supported guest operating system using Linux kernel 5.19 or later. It may be required to manually enable settings in a compatible BIOS for support for AMD SEVES. For more information, refer to the specific vendor documentation. In this BIOS example, we must enter the number of SEVES capable VMs that we want to run plus 1. For example, the value of 13 shown here defines that 12 VMs will be capable to use SEVES on this host. You enable AMD SEVES using PowerCLI 12.1. This can be done during new VM creation using the -sev enabled flag of the new VM commandlet, or it can be configured on an existing virtual machine using the sev enabled flag for the setvm commandlet. There is currently no UI support to enable or disable AMD SEVES support for virtual machines. There are some limitations when using AMD SEV ES support on virtual machines. Virtual machines will no longer be supported to vSphere vMotion, storage vMotion, be enabled for fault tolerance, cloning, suspend and resume, snapshot activities, and virtual device hot add. The ESXi host will log messages related to AMD SEVES to the VM kernel log under var log vmk warning. These messages will be tagged SEV. Similarly, for any virtual machine enabled with SEVES, the virtual machine vmr.log will also record messages tagged with SEV. Consider the following problems and resolutions. If the SEV driver does not load or an SEV-enabled VM fails to power on, this may be an indication that the ESXi host BIOS does not have the appropriate settings enabled. These can commonly be referred to as SME enabled and SEVES ASID count. These terms may differ depending on the specific hardware in use. Again, refer to the individual vendor documentation for more. In the vmk warning.log file, we may see the error message, secure memory encryption is disabled by FW settings. This is an indication that the BIOS setting, secure memory encryption, is not currently enabled. If the vmk warning.log file reports the message SEVES not supported, physical memory larger than reduced physical space, this is an indication that the host physical memory exceeds the supported maximum. In this case, SEVES currently cannot be used on this ESXi host. If we see the error message fail to initialize ASID map in the vmk warning.log file, we may need to increase the value of the BIOS setting SEVES ASID count. So at the end of this video, we've met the following learner objectives. We've described enhanced vMotion compatibility for VSGA GPU VMs, enabled enhanced vMotion compatibility for VSGA GPU VMs, described AMD SEVES support, and identified the requirements for AMD SEVES support. The key points are that EVC for VSGA GPUs defines a common baseline of GPU feature sets. It can be defined at a cluster level or at a virtual machine level. Secure encrypted virtualization encrypted state encrypts a virtual machine's guest memory and register state. Thank you, and I hope you've enjoyed this video.